Good morning. Today I want to talk with you about sunchokes or Jerusalem artichokes. Some people call them topinambur. I probably pronounced that wrong. Anyway, they are relatives of the sunflower. They grow underground from the roots of the flower, and they kind of look like this. Actually, they look exactly like this because that's what these are. There are two different varieties that I have here. This one is a more reddish variety. It might look kind of just gray there, but it's a reddish variety. This variety is obviously more of a white variety, and if you cut into it, it's white. If you cut into this one, it's a little bit on the pinkish side. So I love Jerusalem artichokes. They are very tasty. They're a little bit sweet. They're a little bit crunchy. They have the texture of a like a water chestnut, and I just find them very enjoyable. What I don't find enjoyable about them is that they give me gas. They give a lot of people gas. In fact, they have earned the nickname the fartichoke, and for good reason. Not everybody gets gas from them, but many people do. And this is because many people don't have the gut bacteria that they need to digest these vegetables properly. That can be remedied, and I will tell you about that further along today. However, what I will tell you about is a failed experiment that was supposed to help me remedy this. And that's going to be the main focus here today, is an epic fail with respect to trying to fix this problem. And I tried to fix it by fermentation, lacto fermentation to be precise. And lacto fermentation is what's used to create sauerkraut, to create fermented pickles, and other fermented vegetables. And it's basically a process by which the sugars in the food are turned into lactic acid, and the lactic acid solution around the vegetable is then used to, well, it then preserves that vegetable for quite a long period of time. So one of the side benefits of this is that lacto fermentation of Jerusalem artichokes can help to break down the main cause of this gas that I've talked about. And that main cause of that gas is an undigestible fiber called inulin. Inulin is what's referred to as a polysaccharide, to use very large terms that I don't properly understand, but it is a little bit sweet, and it is one of the reasons that Jerusalem artichokes taste sweet, although I think much of the sweetness can be attributed to fructose, which is another sugar that's found in Jerusalem artichokes. So I did manage to lacto ferment Jerusalem artichokes with some problems along the way, and I'll tell you a little bit about why I think those problems happened, what you might do to remedy those problems, but also why the final product, even the one that worked out best, the one example that worked out best, is just not quite what I want. And so I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do instead of this, and that'll be at the end of this video. But my experiment, I fermented 5 different jars of Jerusalem artichokes, and I followed a recipe that I found on the PBS website. I would not recommend this recipe for a couple of reasons. And so one is that if you want to use this recipe, you should up the amount of brine that you use. The initial recipe calls for 1 quart of brine to 2 pounds of Jerusalem artichokes. I found that to be about half as much brine as I needed. So in that respect, you really don't want to follow the recipe. The other is that the brine called for 2 tablespoons of salt for that 1 quart of water. I'm not sure that that's sufficient for the Jerusalem artichokes to always come out properly through the fermentation process. I don't know if that's one of the reasons that they didn't work out for me, but I think it may very well be part of the reason. So the other thing is that the recipe calls for only 5 days of fermentation. And it sounds to me like what they did was they adjusted a sauerkraut recipe for these Jerusalem artichokes, because you can get away with that with something that's shaved very fine. You can get away with only 5 days of fermentation. With something that is a thicker vegetable, and Jerusalem artichokes are larger, they suggested cutting them into smaller pieces, but even cutting them into smaller pieces, you're still probably going to have larger chunks than if you shredded it. And that was not the recipe. It takes a while for the fermentation process to get into the center of something larger. So when you find fermented pickle recipes, quite often you're looking at more like 5 weeks, 7 weeks of time for the fermentation process. And this is saying 5 days. I'm not convinced that the person who wrote this recipe actually ended up with a fermented product after 5 days. I think maybe it wasn't finished fermenting, and maybe that's why they enjoyed them more. I'm not entirely sure, but anyway, far be it for me to say that this can't be done properly by that recipe, but I was not successful using that particular recipe. So I processed these lacto fermentation. It took longer than 5 days. I started tasting them after 5 days, and it wasn't quite right. And it worked out to be, I think in the end, more like 10 or 12 days before they got to the point where they seemed that they were done. But I had a variety of colors and smells, let's just say, in the finished product. One of them smelled like sauerkraut, smelled kind of fresh. It was a fresh, kind of clear, almost pinkish color, I think probably due to the fact that I used some pink Jerusalem artichokes. And that one tasted the most like sauerkraut. At the far other end of the spectrum, I had one that really went off, and that smelled like if you have your compost sitting by the side of the sink and you leave it for a few extra days, and it's got some real activity going on there, and you open up the cover and you smell it, that's kind of what it smelled like. It wasn't pleasant at all, and I just got rid of that batch. And then in between those two extremes, there's kind of this funky smell. And it's funny because I've done research on Jerusalem artichokes and what people have ended up with in their ferments, and many of them describe the smell as funky. I would suggest that if it smells funky, something went a little awry in the process, and you should probably just compost it. Judging by this range of smells that I had, and the fact that the one that tasted best tasted and smelled most like a successful sauerkraut, if it smells funky in a way that doesn't smell like a successful sauerkraut, I would say to avoid eating it. I did try some of them in that spectrum and just didn't find them enjoyable at all. And even the one that tasted like sauerkraut, it turns out that I just don't want to eat a big lump of sauerkraut. I enjoy sauerkraut as a side dish with sausages or what have you, but I am not a huge fan of just eating larger chunks of that as a maybe an appetizer or a side dish or what have you. They're just, or a snack. They're just not that appealing to me. Maybe you would like them. To me, just not that appealing. So the one thing that I did find, though, was that eating these after they were lacto fermented, it did solve the gas problem, or it did seem to solve the gas problem. I don't have, when I was snacking on these, testing them, Didn't have much problem with that. So, okay, that problem was solved. The other issues that came up ended up in me wasting an awful lot of Jerusalem artichokes that I could have saved and preserved in another way. So my main goal was to get rid of the gas producing inulin effect. I have found another way to take care of that. And this is going to sound like an advertisement. It's not, nobody paid me to say this, but there are probiotic supplements that you can get that will help you to digest inulin. So whenever I'm eating the sunchokes, I take one of these. It's called BioGaia. Very tasty, and it helps you to have the I guess the gut bacteria that helps you digest these. My hope is that by taking this over time, along with eating the Jerusalem artichokes, I will feed that gut bacteria and perhaps change it a little bit so that I am more able to digest these without taking supplements. Ideally, I don't really want to have to take a supplement every time I eat Jerusalem artichokes, but it's worth it to me because I really like them. So if I've found a way to take care of this gaseous effect, then what is another way that I can store these? Now, you could conceivably do like a bread and butter pickle recipe with them. I haven't tried it, but I think that would be more appealing than the lacto fermented version of the Jerusalem artichokes, at least for me. I don't know. But then, the question always, whenever I'm preserving something, what I try to ask myself in advance is, am I really going to eat that much of it in the way that I've, preserved it? And I'm going to be honest, I have jars of things in my basement that I spend an awful lot of time preserving. Some of them we go through like crazy. Like when I can pears, we go through canned pears. I have to ration them. Applesauce, same thing. It's really great to save your own applesauce because we can eat as much applesauce, at least my family can, as I can save and produce. Other things like dilly beans, we don't eat as much of, and there are, like, I canned a few years ago hosta shoots. I love hosta shoots fresh. I canned them in a kind of a sweet pickle brine, and I just can't get excited about them when I open them up. So they just stay there and hope that I'll eat them. And I have the same problem with green tomatoes that I've canned. I love them when I open them up, but for some reason I'm just not compelled to. So quite often those will stay for a long time too. So anyway, if you're going to preserve something, find a way that you can keep it so you will feel compelled to eat it, so you still enjoy it enough. And sometimes that can be the simplest method. In the case of Jerusalem artichokes, for me, it turns out that it is the simplest method. And I've done this before and really didn't think about it in terms of saving this large crop that I had this year. But what I've done before is I've taken samples of my Jerusalem artichokes and put them in the refrigerator and I have a refrigerator that I use for seeds and stuff, so it's not in my regular refrigerator. And put them in just slightly damp vermiculite. Just a little bit of water in here because the Jerusalem artichokes will actually share some of their own dampness with the vermiculite over time, and then we'll kind of keep at the right moisture level. But I do add a little bit of water before I do that. When I do that and I put them in the fridge, most of the time they will stay straight through the wintertime, and as I'm sharing them out with friends, I'll just pull a bag out of the fridge and send them or give them to people at swaps, and they're just fine. So why I didn't think about just taking some soil, putting these into that soil and putting it in my cool attic, which some people use a root cellar. My attic tends to stay about the right temperature through the course of the winter. It doesn't really freeze, but it stays cool enough to keep things from like dahlia bulbs and Jerusalem artichokes from starting to sprout. And so you can keep it. Why I didn't decide to store it that way, I don't know. But that's what I will be doing in the future to store my Jerusalem artichokes. So that's the story, and that was my failure with preserving Jerusalem artichokes via lacto fermentation. Yeah, even when it worked, it just wasn't that appealing. It lost the sweetness that I really like in the Jerusalem artichoke. I can't think what I would do with quart upon quart of pickled, like lacto fermented Jerusalem artichokes. I just can't think of a recipe that I would use them in. However, I do have some, and so if you have any ideas for what I can do with these, these lacto fermented Jerusalem artichokes, please drop me a comment below. Also, if you have other methods of preserving them or that you really, really like, things that you feel compelled to eat, things that you are looking forward to eating this winter or anytime you preserve them that way, I'd love to hear more about that. If you have ever other ways of getting rid of the gaseous properties of them, please share that as well. I'd love to hear that too. And in general, if you want to connect, lots of ways to connect with me, whether it's in the comments below or on Instagram at Food Forest Garden Club, or on the new website the new website is actually foodforestgardenclub.org. Still under development. There's a contact us form on there, and I'll be adding a whole lot more information to that going forward. So hope you enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe to this channel. I could use all the support I can get here, and I really appreciate you stopping by and watching. Have a great day.